24 years ago, Thomas and Margaret Chen disappeared after their evening shift at Roswell General Hospital, leaving behind nothing but questions and two 18-year-old twins who would spend over a decade searching for answers. What should have been an ordinary Tuesday night in March 2001 became the beginning of a mystery that would consume the Chen family and divide a community already haunted by its own legendary secrets. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. The Chen family had called Roswell home for 8 years. Thomas, a dedicated radiologic technologist, and Margaret, a night shift nurse, were pillars of their community. Hard-working immigrants who had built their American dream in the shadow of New Mexico's most famous city, they were known for their reliability, their kindness, and their unwavering devotion to their twin children, Sarah and Michael. On March 13, 2001, both parents finished their shifts at exactly 11:47 p.m. Security footage shows them walking to their silver Honda Accord in the hospital parking lot, Margaret carrying her usual thermos of coffee, Thomas checking his phone. They appeared relaxed, normal, completely unaware that in less than 2 hours their lives would intersect with something that defied explanation. What happened between midnight and 2 a.m. that night would fracture not just a family, but challenge everything investigators thought they understood about missing persons cases. Multiple witnesses reported strange, pulsating lights hovering over the southeastern outskirts of Roswell, lights that moved with purpose, intelligence, and a silence that made the desert air feel heavy with anticipation. The Chen's abandoned Honda was found at 6:23 a.m. the next morning by a jogger, parked perfectly along Highway 285, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. Margaret's coffee thermos sat untouched in the cup holder, still warm. Thomas's wallet remained in the glove compartment, containing $127 in cash and all his credit cards. Their cell phones were found on the dashboard, batteries drained to zero, despite being fully charged when they left the hospital. But it was what wasn't found that haunted everyone. No signs of struggle, no skid marks, no footprints leading away from the vehicle. Thomas and Margaret Chen had simply vanished. For 18-year-old twins, Sarah and Michael, the discovery transformed them from college-bound teenagers into desperate investigators overnight. The police assured them it was a routine missing persons case, that their parents would surface soon, probably having suffered some kind of mental health crisis or marital breakdown. The twins knew better. They knew their parents. They knew this was different. The official investigation lasted 6 weeks before being quietly archived. The Roswell Police Department, already sensitive about anything that might attract unwanted attention to their city's unusual reputation, preferred to classify the case as voluntary disappearance, rather than admit they had no leads, no suspects, and no logical explanation for how two people could vanish so completely. But Sarah and Michael Chen refused to accept silence as an answer. The months following their parents' disappearance revealed the true cost of unanswered questions. Sarah, who had been accepted to pre-med at University of New Mexico, deferred her enrollment indefinitely. Michael, a promising computer science student, dropped his scholarship to stay in Roswell and coordinate search efforts. The twins moved into their parents' small adobe house on Pine Street, surrounded by memories and determined to find truth in a case the authorities had abandoned. The community response was mixed and painful. Some neighbors rallied around the Chen twins, organizing search parties that combed the Pecos River Valley and the endless desert landscapes surrounding Roswell. Others whispered that perhaps the family had brought this upon themselves, that in a town trying to distance itself from UFO tourism and alien conspiracy theories, the Chens had somehow invited the very attention Roswell wanted to escape. Local media coverage was brief and dismissive. The Roswell Daily Record ran a single article titled "Hospital Workers Missing," which focused more on the strain of healthcare worker shortages than on the mysterious circumstances of the disappearance. Television stations from Albuquerque sent crews for exactly 1 day before deciding the story lacked the compelling elements needed for sustained coverage. Detective Maria Santos, the lead investigator assigned to the case, genuinely wanted to help. A 15-year veteran of the Roswell PD, Santos had seen her share of domestic disputes, drug-related disappearances, and tragic accidents, but the Chen case was different. It lacked the typical patterns of voluntary disappearance or foul play. The couple's finances were stable, their marriage solid, their relationship with their children loving and supportive. There were no gambling debts, no secret affairs, no history of mental illness or substance abuse. "I've never seen anything like it," Santos would later tell the twins during one of their weekly check-ins. "It's like they walked out of their car and into thin air. No trace, no leads, no logical explanation. In 24 years of police work, this case keeps me awake at night." The strange lights witnessed that evening added another layer of complexity. 17 residents of southeastern Roswell reported seeing the unusual aerial phenomena between midnight and 2:15 a.m. The lights were described consistently, 3 large pulsating orbs that moved in perfect formation, completely silent, hovering approximately 200 feet above the desert floor near where the Chen's car would later be discovered. Among the witnesses was retired Air Force Colonel James Mitchell, who had spent 30 years at nearby Walker Air Force Base before its closure in 1967. Mitchell was adamant that what he observed was unlike any conventional or experimental aircraft he had encountered during his military career. His testimony carried weight in a community that had learned to be skeptical of UFO reports, but Mitchell's credibility was unassailable. Sarah and Michael spent their days creating missing person flyers, their evenings driving the highways around Roswell, and their nights researching every missing persons case in New Mexico history. They established a tip hotline using their father's old cell phone number, interviewed every witness to the strange lights, and mapped out timelines with the precision of professional investigators. The first year passed without a single substantive lead. As 2002 turned into 2003, Sarah finally enrolled at the University of New Mexico, but chose to major in criminal justice instead of medicine. Michael taught himself advanced computer programming and began developing database systems to track missing persons cases across the southwestern United States. Neither twin dated, neither made plans that extended beyond finding their parents. Their lives had been suspended in March 2001, waiting for answers that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. Friends began urging them to move on, to accept that some questions don't have answers. Well-meaning relatives suggested grief counseling, time away from Roswell, the possibility that their parents had chosen to disappear and start new lives elsewhere. The twins listened politely to these suggestions, then returned to their methodical, obsessive search for truth. By 2004, even Detective Santos had been reassigned to other cases. The official file on Thomas and Margaret Chen joined hundreds of other cold cases in the Roswell Police Department's archives, where it would remain untouched for nearly 8 more years. But Sarah and Michael never stopped looking. They never stopped believing that somewhere in the vast New Mexico desert, answers were waiting to be found. The middle years, 2005 through 2010, were the most difficult for Sarah and Michael Chen. The initial surge of community support had faded, media attention had disappeared entirely, and the steady rhythm of their investigation had settled into a grinding routine of following leads that invariably led nowhere. Sarah graduated from UNM in 2007 with a degree in criminal justice and immediately joined the Roswell Police Department as a patrol officer. Her colleagues understood her motivation, but worried about her objectivity. How could she serve the community effectively when her personal trauma remained so close to the surface? Sarah proved them wrong through sheer professionalism and competence, earning respect even from officers who had initially questioned her hiring. Michael had transformed their parents' house into a makeshift investigation center. The living room walls were covered with maps, timelines, witness statements, and photographs of the abandoned Honda. He had built sophisticated computer models attempting to track movement patterns around Roswell on the night of March 13, 2001, cross-referencing traffic camera data, cell phone tower logs, and even weather patterns that might have affected visibility. The strange lights phenomenon had not repeated itself, at least not in any way that generated witness reports or official documentation. This absence of recurring events actually made the case more puzzling. If the lights had been some kind of experimental military aircraft, why had similar sightings never been reported before or since? If they represented some natural atmospheric phenomenon, why had they never been explained or replicated? Detective Santos, now promoted to sergeant, would occasionally stop by to check on Michael's progress. She remained the only active law enforcement officer who still considered the Chen disappearance an open case worth pursuing. During these informal visits, Santos shared information that wasn't part of the official file, rumors she had heard, tips that had seemed too unreliable to investigate officially, patterns she had noticed in other missing persons cases across New Mexico. One conversation in late 2008 proved particularly significant. Santos mentioned that she had been contacted by investigators from 3 other southwestern jurisdictions, Las Cruces, Farmington, and Alamogordo, about missing persons cases that shared unusual similarities with the Chen disappearance. In each instance, the missing individuals had been found near highways, with their vehicles abandoned but undamaged, personal belongings undisturbed, and no evidence of struggle or foul play. The difference, Santos explained to Michael, is that those people eventually came home. Days later, sometimes weeks later, but they came home. They claimed to have no memory of where they had been or what had happened during their absence. Medical examinations found them to be in perfect health, sometimes better health than when they had disappeared. Michael pressed for more details. Had any of these cases involved witnesses reporting strange lights? Had the missing individuals undergone psychological evaluation? Were there any common factors beyond the mysterious circumstances of their temporary disappearances? Santos promised to make some calls to see what additional information she might be able to access through official channels. But she also warned Michael about the dangers of seeing patterns where none might exist, of allowing hope to override critical thinking in cases where the evidence remained frustratingly thin. By 2009, Sarah had been promoted to detective, though she was carefully assigned to cases unrelated to missing persons investigations. Michael had exhausted most of his parents' life insurance money, maintaining their house and funding his private investigation. Both twins were approaching 30. Both remained unmarried, and both continued to structure their entire lives around a mystery that seemed increasingly unlikely to be solved. The 10th anniversary of their parents' disappearance, March 13, 2011, brought a brief resurgence of media attention. The Roswell Daily Record ran a retrospective article. Local television news produced a short segment, and several UFO research organizations included the Chen case in their annual reports on unexplained phenomena. For a few weeks, the tip hotline Michael maintained received calls from across the country, though none provided new leads or credible information. Sarah and Michael marked the anniversary by driving to the spot on Highway 285, where their parents' car had been found. They stood in the desert silence, watching the sun set over the Pecos River Valley, feeling the weight of a decade's worth of unanswered questions. The landscape looked exactly the same as it had in 2001, endless, indifferent, keeping its secrets buried in sand and silence. Neither twin spoke during the drive home, but both were thinking the same thing. How much longer could they continue this search? How many more years could they sacrifice to a mystery that might never be solved? The answer to that question would come sooner than they imagined, in the form of a phone call that would arrive on a quiet Tuesday evening in September 2012, exactly 11 years and 6 months after their parents had vanished into the New Mexico night. September 18th, 2012. Michael Chen was debugging code at his computer when the house phone rang at 9:47 p.m. After 11 years of maintaining their parents' landline as a tip hotline, most calls came from conspiracy theorists, amateur UFO researchers, or well-meaning but misinformed individuals who claimed to have seen Thomas and Margaret at gas stations in Texas or shopping malls in Colorado. Michael had learned to listen patiently, take notes, and gently explain why their information didn't match the established facts of the case. But this call was different. The voice on the other end was elderly, shaky, and terrified. Is this about the Chen family? The couple that went missing? Yes, sir. This is Michael Chen. Thomas and Margaret were my parents. A long pause. Then, my name is Dr. Harold Voss. I used to work at a facility near Roswell. I have been following your case for years, son. I think it's time I told someone what I know. Dr. Harold Voss was 91 years old, a retired physicist who had spent 37 years working on classified projects at various government installations throughout New Mexico. In 1952, fresh out of MIT with a doctorate in theoretical physics, he had been recruited to work on what he described only as atmospheric phenomena research at a facility whose official designation remained classified even in 2012. I can't tell you everything, Dr. Voss explained during their first meeting at his modest apartment in Las Cruces. Even after all these years, some things are still restricted. But I can tell you that what happened to your parents, it wasn't the first time, and it wasn't an accident. Sarah had driven down from Roswell to join Michael for this conversation. Both twins sat in Dr. Voss's small living room, surrounded by bookshelves filled with physics textbooks and framed photographs of what appeared to be military installations and research facilities. The elderly physicist moved slowly, but spoke with precision, choosing each word carefully, as if navigating through a minefield of classified information. The lights your witnesses reported, 3 large pulsating orbs moving in formation, match exactly with phenomena we documented during our research program between 1952 and 1979. We called them controlled atmospheric manifestations. The public called them UFOs. Both descriptions were incomplete. Dr. Voss explained that the research program had been designed to study and eventually replicate what appeared to be advanced propulsion technology recovered from various crash sites in New Mexico during the late 1940s and early 1950s. The goal was to understand the physics behind these aerial phenomena and determine whether the technology could be adapted for military or scientific applications. The problem, he continued, was that the technology seemed to respond to certain individuals in ways we couldn't predict or control. Some people could approach the recovered materials without incident. Others experienced what we termed temporal displacement events. Michael leaned forward. Temporal displacement. They would vanish for periods ranging from hours to weeks, then return with no memory of their absence. Medical examinations showed they were in perfect health, sometimes appearing younger than when they had disappeared. We documented 47 such incidents between 1952 and 1979, when the program was officially terminated. Sarah's police training kicked in. Dr. Voss, are you saying my parents were abducted by some kind of government experiment? The physicist shook his head slowly. Not abducted, Detective Chen. Selected. The technology appeared to have some kind of awareness. It chose specific individuals based on criteria we never fully understood. Your parents weren't randomly taken. They were specifically identified and retrieved. Dr. Voss reached into a filing cabinet and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be technical specifications. This is everything I was able to preserve from the program files before they were destroyed in 1979. I've been carrying this information for over 30 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. When I read about your parents' case and saw the witness descriptions of the lights, I knew their disappearance was connected to our research. The documents were extraordinary, technical drawings of craft that defied conventional aerodynamics, photographs of strange metallic materials that appeared to shift and change shape depending on the viewing angle, medical reports on individuals who had experienced temporal displacement events, including brain scans showing unusual neural activity patterns. Most disturbing were the personal files on each displaced individual, detailed psychological profiles, family histories, and what appeared to be genetic analyses. Dr. Voss explained that the research team had eventually identified common characteristics among those selected for temporal displacement: above-average intelligence, strong emotional bonds with family members, and specific genetic markers that seemed to influence their compatibility with the recovered technology. Your parents matched the profile perfectly, Dr. Voss said quietly. Both highly intelligent healthcare professionals, devoted to their children, carrying genetic markers we had learned to recognize. When I saw their case file in the newspaper, I knew immediately what had happened to them. Michael's hands were shaking as he examined the documents. Dr. Voss, if this technology was selecting people for temporal displacement, and if most of them came back after a few weeks, why haven't our parents returned? The elderly physicist was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of guilt and regret. Because in 1979, when the government terminated our research program, they didn't just shut down the project. They moved the recovered technology to a more secure location, a place where the temporal displacement events could be extended indefinitely. Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. Extended how? The displaced individuals were being held in a state of temporal suspension, conscious but unable to age, unable to return to their original timeline without direct intervention. As far as I know, the facility is still operational, and your parents, along with dozens of other displaced individuals collected over the past 30 years, are still there. Dr. Voss slid one final document across the table, It was a hand-drawn map of the area surrounding Roswell, with a location marked approximately 40 miles southeast of the city. This is where you'll find them. But I have to warn you, the facility is heavily secured, completely off-limits to civilian access, and officially doesn't exist. Approaching it will put you in serious danger. As Sarah and Michael drove back to Roswell that night, both twins sat in stunned silence. After 11 years of searching for answers, they had finally found someone who could explain their parents' disappearance. But the explanation was more disturbing than anything they had imagined, and the path to reuniting with Thomas and Margaret Chen would require them to challenge forces far more powerful than local law enforcement. The investigation was about to become something much larger and more dangerous than a missing persons case. The weeks following their meeting with Dr. Harold Voss transformed Sarah and Michael Chen from grieving children into strategic investigators. The elderly physicist's revelations had provided them with their first real leads in over a decade, but pursuing those leads would require careful planning, absolute discretion, and a willingness to risk everything they had built in their search for truth. Sarah used her position in the Roswell Police Department to access satellite imagery and government land records for the area Dr. Voss had marked on his map. The location was officially designated as Federal Research Station 47, though no such facility appeared in any public database or military installation directory. Satellite photos from Google Earth showed only empty desert, but Sarah's police training had taught her to recognize digital image manipulation. The smooth, uniform appearance of the terrain suggested that satellite data for this region was being actively scrubbed or replaced. Michael applied his computer skills to researching Dr. Harold Voss himself, verifying his credentials and attempting to confirm the existence of the classified research program he had described. The physicist's academic background was impeccable. MIT doctorate, 37 years of employment with various government contractors, numerous patents filed under restricted classification. But finding any official record of the Atmospheric Phenomena Research Program proved impossible. Either the project had been completely erased from government archives, or it was buried under layers of classification that would never be accessible to civilian investigators. The twins decided to conduct physical surveillance of the location Dr. Voss had identified. Using vacation time Sarah had accumulated over 5 years with the police department, they spent 4 days camping in the desert, approximately 10 miles from the suspected facility coordinates. They brought high-powered telescopes, night vision equipment Michael had purchased online, and military surplus communication devices that would allow them to maintain contact if they decided to approach the site separately. What they observed confirmed their worst fears and highest hopes simultaneously. The area appeared completely empty during daylight hours, nothing but endless desert landscape broken by occasional mesas and dry creek beds. But after sunset, subtle signs of activity became visible to trained observers. Perfectly straight tire tracks appeared in sand that had looked undisturbed hours earlier. Distant lights moved in geometric patterns that suggested vehicle traffic along roads that didn't officially exist. Most disturbing, on their third night of observation, Sarah spotted what appeared to be aircraft landing and taking off from a location where satellite imagery showed only empty desert. "Michael, look at this," Sarah whispered, handing her brother the night vision scope. 2 o'clock, about 6 miles out. Michael adjusted the focus and saw them immediately. 3 aircraft unlike anything in his experience with civilian or military aviation. They moved completely silently, hovered motionless above the desert floor, and exhibited the same pulsating light patterns described by witnesses to his parents' disappearance in 2001. "Those are the lights," Michael said quietly. "Those are exactly what people saw the night Mom and Dad vanished." The twins documented everything they observed: vehicle movement patterns, aircraft arrival and departure schedules, the precise location of what appeared to be concealed access roads leading to the underground facility. They photographed the strange aircraft using telephoto lenses, though the images were frustratingly unclear due to the distance and the unusual properties of the lights themselves. On their final night of surveillance, something extraordinary happened. Sarah was monitoring the facility through her telescope when she spotted a group of approximately 20 individuals walking in formation across the desert floor. Even at a distance of several miles, she could see that they moved with unusual coordination, as if following predetermined paths invisible to outside observers. Their clothing appeared to be identical, simple grey uniforms that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the moonlight. "Michael, I need you to see this. There are people out there." Michael took the telescope and studied the distant figures. They were definitely human, definitely walking freely rather than under guard or restraint, but their behavior was unlike anything he had ever observed. They moved with mechanical precision, spacing themselves at exact intervals, stopping and starting in perfect unison, as if responding to signals the twins couldn't detect. Could those be people who have been displaced? People like Mom and Dad? Sarah felt her heart racing. After 11 years of theoretical investigation, they were potentially looking at visual confirmation that their parents might still be alive, still accessible, held at a facility that officially didn't exist, but clearly operated with government knowledge and support. The decision to attempt direct contact with the facility was made that night, as the twins packed up their surveillance equipment and prepared for the most dangerous phase of their investigation. They had spent over a decade searching for answers. Now they had found not only answers, but potentially a path to reuniting with the parents they had never stopped believing were alive. Dr. Voss had warned them that approaching the facility would be dangerous, that the installation was heavily secured and completely off-limits to civilian access. But Sarah and Michael Chen had already sacrificed their 20s to this search. They were prepared to sacrifice much more if it meant bringing Thomas and Margaret Chen home after 11 years of temporal displacement. As they drove back to Roswell, Sarah placed a call to Detective Santos, now a lieutenant with the police department. "Maria, it's Sarah. I need to ask you for something that's going to sound completely insane, but I need you to trust me. If Michael and I disappear for a few days, I need you to wait exactly 72 hours before filing a missing persons report, and when you do file it, I need you to focus the search on Federal Research Station 47, approximately 40 miles southeast of the city." Santos was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, what are you planning to do?" "We're going to find our parents, and we're going to bring them home." If this case has already captivated you, hit the like button. It helps the story of the Chen family reach more people. October 15th, 2012. Sarah and Michael Chen stood at the edge of the desert, watching the sun rise over coordinates that had consumed their thoughts for nearly a month. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, studying satellite imagery, planning approach routes, and gathering equipment that would give them the best chance of reaching Federal Research Station 47 undetected. The twins had learned from their surveillance that the facility maintained a predictable security schedule. Patrols followed specific routes that created brief windows of opportunity for unauthorized access. Most importantly, they had observed that the strange aircraft operations occurred primarily between midnight and 4 a.m., suggesting that daylight hours might offer their safest approach window. Sarah carried her service weapon, though she harbored no illusions about its effectiveness against whatever security measures protected the installation. Michael had loaded his backpack with electronic equipment, signal detectors, camera equipment, and GPS devices that would help them document their location and maintain contact with the outside world for as long as possible. They had left detailed letters with Lieutenant Santos, to be opened only if they failed to return within 72 hours. The letters contained copies of all their research, including Dr. Voss's classified documents, photographs from their surveillance, and explicit instructions for reopening the official investigation into Thomas and Margaret Chen's disappearance. The approach took 4 hours of careful navigation across terrain that appeared empty, but revealed subtle signs of human activity to trained observers. Tire tracks that had been carefully camouflaged but not completely erased. Patches of desert where the sand had been recently disturbed and hastily smoothed. Most tellingly, vegetation patterns that suggested underground construction, areas where desert plants grew differently, indicating the presence of buried structures that altered natural water drainage. At 11:30 a.m., they found it. The entrance to Federal Research Station 47 was virtually invisible from ground level, a section of desert floor that appeared completely natural but concealed sophisticated access controls. Sarah spotted the installation only because her police training had taught her to recognize camouflaged surveillance equipment. Hidden among what appeared to be natural rock formations were cameras, motion sensors, and communication arrays that clearly served a security function. "Michael, look at the pattern of those rocks. They're too perfectly arranged to be natural. And see that cactus about 30 feet to the left? The angle is wrong for the sun exposure it would need to grow there. Michael studied the area through binoculars and immediately understood what his system meant. The entire landscape had been artificially constructed to conceal what was obviously a significant underground installation. Sarah, if we cross that ridge, we're going to trigger whatever security systems they have in place. There's no way to approach this facility without being detected. Then, we don't approach secretly. We approach officially. Sarah stood up from behind the rock formation where they had been hiding and began walking directly toward the concealed entrance, hands clearly visible and away from her weapon. Michael followed, heart racing but trusting his sister's judgment. They had covered approximately 50 yards when the desert floor in front of them simply opened. A section of sand and rock that had appeared completely solid lifted smoothly upward, revealing a concrete ramp leading down into a brightly lit underground facility. Two individuals in military-style uniforms emerged from the entrance, though their equipment and insignia matched no branch of service Sarah recognized from her law enforcement training. "Detective Sarah Chen, Roswell Police Department," Sarah called out, showing her badge. "This is my brother Michael. We're here to inquire about our parents, Thomas and Margaret Chen, who disappeared from Roswell in March 2001. The security personnel exchanged glances, but did not draw weapons or appear surprised by the twins' arrival. One of them, a woman who appeared to be in her 40s, approached with what seemed like professional courtesy rather than hostility. "Detective Chen, Mr. Chen, you are expected. Please accompany us. Director Williams would like to speak with you." Expected. The word hit both twins simultaneously. After weeks of planning a covert approach to a facility that officially didn't exist, they had walked directly into what was obviously a carefully orchestrated meeting. Their investigation, their surveillance, their presence here, none of it had been as secret as they had believed. The underground facility was unlike anything either twin had imagined. Corridors stretched in multiple directions, lined with doors that bore no identifying markings or numbers. The lighting was somehow too bright and too soft simultaneously, creating an environment that felt artificially controlled. Most disturbing was the silence. Despite what was clearly a large installation staffed by dozens of people, they heard no conversations, no mechanical sounds, no evidence of the normal activity that should characterize a working facility. Director Williams turned out to be a man in his 60s, impeccably dressed in a suit that looked expensive but bore no identifying logos or government insignia. His office was spartanly furnished, a desk, 3 chairs, and walls covered with monitors displaying what appeared to be surveillance footage from locations throughout New Mexico. "Detective Chen, Mr. Chen, please sit down. I believe you have questions about your parents." Sarah felt her police instincts engaging. This man was calm, prepared, and clearly accustomed to being in control of conversations. "Director Williams, we have reason to believe Thomas and Margaret Chen are being held at this facility against their will. We're here to request their immediate release." Williams smiled slightly. "They're not being held against their will, Detective. They're being protected, just as you are about to be protected." Michael leaned forward. "Protected from what?" "From a timeline that no longer exists. From a reality that was altered the moment they encountered our technology. Your parents experienced what Dr. Voss undoubtedly described as temporal displacement. What he didn't explain is that the displacement is irreversible through conventional means. Your parents can't return to their original timeline because that timeline has been modified by their absence." Williams gestured to one of the monitors on his wall. The screen showed surveillance footage of a suburban house that Sarah and Michael immediately recognized as their childhood home on Pine Street. But the footage was wrong. It showed their house as it had appeared in 2001, with their parents' car in the driveway and lights on in windows that had been dark for 11 years. "This facility exists outside normal temporal flow," Williams continued. "Everyone here, your parents, the other displaced individuals, our staff, exists in a state of temporal suspension that allows us to observe and occasionally modify events in the standard timeline. Your parents are alive, healthy, and aware of your search for them. They've been watching your investigation, proud of your persistence, but concerned about the danger you've been placing yourselves in." Sarah stood up abruptly. "I want to see them. Right now." Williams nodded. "That can be arranged, Detective Chen, but I need you to understand that once you see them, Once you confirm they're alive and well, you'll face the same choice they faced in 2001. You can return to your timeline, where they will remain missing forever. Or you can join them here in temporal suspension, where your family can be together but where you'll be unable to impact events in the world you've known. The twins exchanged glances. After 11 years of searching, they were being offered exactly what they had dreamed of, reunion with their parents, but the cost would be sacrificing their own lives in the timeline where Thomas and Margaret Chen had been missing for over a decade. Before you decide, Williams added, let me show you what your parents have been working on during their time here. I think you'll find their project relevant to your situation. The corridor Director Williams led them through seemed to extend forever, lined with doors that bore cryptic alphanumeric codes instead of names or departments. The silence that had characterized the facility since their arrival was broken only by the soft hum of ventilation systems and the occasional distant sound of machinery operating far below their current level. Sarah's police instincts remained on high alert, but Michael found himself studying the architecture with fascination. The walls appeared to be constructed from a material he didn't recognize, something that looked like concrete, but seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The ceiling was too high for the corridor's width, creating a sense of vast space that felt both impressive and somehow oppressive. The facility was constructed between 1979 and 1983, Williams explained, as they walked, apparently reading Michael's curiosity. We incorporated recovered technology into the building materials themselves, creating an environment that exists partially outside normal spacetime. This allows us to maintain temporal stability for our displaced personnel while conducting research that would be impossible in conventional facilities. They stopped at a door marked only with the designation Laboratory 7A. Williams placed his hand on what appeared to be a simple metal plate, but Sarah noticed that the scanner was actually reading something more complex than fingerprints, possibly DNA or some other biological marker that couldn't be easily replicated. The door slid open silently, revealing a large laboratory space that looked more like a high-tech medical facility than anything Sarah associated with government research installations. The room contained sophisticated computer equipment, medical monitoring devices, and several workstations where individuals in white lab coats were examining what appeared to be metallic objects that shifted color and shape as they moved. And there, bent over a computer terminal in the far corner of the lab, were Thomas and Margaret Chen. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her parents looked exactly as they had in March 2001, not a day older, not a grey hair different, wearing the same type of casual clothing they had preferred for their off-duty hours at Roswell General Hospital. Thomas was studying data, scrolling across multiple monitors, while Margaret was manipulating what appeared to be a piece of the same strange metallic material the other researchers were examining. "Mom," Sarah called softly. Both parents looked up simultaneously, and the expressions that crossed their faces contained 11 years' worth of love, relief, and heartbreak, compressed into a single moment. Margaret dropped the metallic object she had been holding and ran toward her children. Thomas was only steps behind. The reunion was everything Sarah and Michael had dreamed of for over a decade, and nothing like what they had imagined. Their parents felt real, solid, unchanged by the years that had passed. But there was something different in their eyes, a depth of knowledge and sadness that hadn't been there in 2001. "We've been watching," Margaret whispered, holding both twins as tightly as she could. "We've seen everything you've done, every sacrifice you've made searching for us. We're so proud of you and so sorry for the pain our disappearances caused." Thomas placed his hands on his children's shoulders, studying faces that had aged 11 years while his remained frozen in time. "Sarah, you became a police officer. Michael, you became an investigator. You both became exactly who you needed to become to find us. But we need you to understand what you found before you decide what to do about it." Director Williams gestured toward the workstations, where other researchers continued their activities. "Your parents have been working on what we call the Temporal Reconciliation Project. The goal is to develop a method for safely returning displaced individuals to their original timeline without causing paradoxes or reality fractures." Margaret led them to her computer terminal, which displayed complex mathematical equations and what appeared to be three-dimensional models of space-time topology. "The technology that brought us here operates on principles of quantum mechanics that we're only beginning to understand. When someone is temporally displaced, they don't simply vanish from one time and appear in another. They create a branching timeline where their disappearance becomes a fixed point in history. Thomas activated another monitor, which showed what appeared to be a family tree diagram, but with temporal coordinates instead of generational relationships. This is your timeline, the reality where we disappeared in March 2001, and you spent 11 years searching for us. And this, he pointed to a parallel branch, is the timeline we currently exist in, where our displacement never occurred. Michael studied the diagrams with his programmer's eye for logical structure. Dad, are you saying there's a version of reality where you never disappeared, where Sarah and I grew up normally? Not just a version, Williams interjected. The primary timeline. Your parents' displacement created what we call a shadow timeline, the reality you've been living in. The goal of the Temporal Reconciliation Project is to merge the timelines, allowing displaced individuals to return to their proper temporal position without negating the experiences of those who lived through their absence. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. You're talking about erasing 11 years of our lives. If you merge the timelines, if our parents never disappeared, then everything we've done, everything we've become because of their absence, would still exist, Margaret said quickly, but as memories of a timeline that no longer defines your reality. You would remember searching for us, but you would also remember growing up with us present. Both sets of memories would be real. Both sets of experiences would be part of who you are. The laboratory around them suddenly felt much smaller and more claustrophobic. After 11 years of searching for their parents, Sarah and Michael were being offered not just reunion, but a complete restoration of the family they had lost. But the cost would be transforming their entire understanding of their own lives and identities. Thomas showed them additional data on his monitors. We've identified 47 other individuals currently in temporal displacement. Families have been searching for missing parents, spouses, children for decades. The Temporal Reconciliation Project could reunite all of them with their families while preserving the experiences and growth that occurred during their absence. The choice, Williams said, is not just about your family. Your parents' work here represents the final breakthrough we needed to begin large-scale temporal reconciliation, but the process requires the voluntary participation of family members from the shadow timeline. You have to choose to merge the timelines. We can't force the process. Michael looked at his sister, seeing his own internal struggle reflected in her eyes. They had found their parents alive and well, engaged in work that could reunite dozens of families torn apart by mysterious disappearances. But accepting the timeline merger would mean acknowledging that their entire adult lives had been lived in a reality that was fundamentally incomplete. What happens if we say no? Sarah asked. What happens if we choose to return to our timeline without merging? Margaret's expression showed pain that cut deeper than 11 years of separation. Then we remain here, in temporal suspension, and you return to a reality where we're still missing. The difference is that now you'll know we're alive but unreachable, which might be a more difficult burden than the uncertainty you've carried. The weight of the decision was overwhelming. After 11 years of searching, the Chen twins had found not just their parents, but the power to restore their family completely. The price was accepting that everything they thought they knew about their own lives was based on a shadow reality created by temporal displacement. Director Williams checked his watch. I can give you some time to consider your options, but I need to tell you that the temporal reconciliation process has a limited window of opportunity. The longer displaced individuals remain in suspension, the more difficult it becomes to merge timelines successfully. As their parents returned to their research work, Sarah and Michael found themselves facing the most important decision of their lives, a choice that would determine not just their own futures, but the fundamental nature of their past. The guest quarters Director Williams provided were Spartan but comfortable. 2 simple rooms connected by a common area, furnished with chairs, a table and monitors, displaying what appeared to be real-time feeds from various locations around Roswell. Sarah and Michael sat in silence for nearly an hour, each processing the enormity of what they had discovered and the impossible choice they faced. Sarah, Michael finally said, do you ever wonder who we would have been if they had never disappeared? Sarah had been staring at one of the monitors, which showed their childhood home on Pine Street as it appeared in the current timeline, empty, maintained by a property management company, waiting for owners who had been missing for 11 years. Every day for the past decade. But Michael, I know who we became because they disappeared. Are you willing to give that up? The question cut to the heart of their dilemma. Sarah had become a police officer, driven by a need to find answers for families devastated by loss. Michael had developed extraordinary investigative skills and technological expertise, focused entirely on solving missing persons cases. Their entire adult identities had been shaped by the trauma of their parents' disappearance. A soft knock on their door interrupted their conversation. Margaret Chen entered, carrying a tray with coffee and sandwiches that looked surprisingly normal, given the surreal nature of their surroundings. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the tray on the table. "I know this is overwhelming. Your father and I have had 11 years to process what happened to us. You've had 11 hours. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, finding comfort in such a simple maternal gesture after so many years. "Mom, can you tell us what it's been like, living here knowing we were searching for you?" Margaret sat down across from her children, and for the first time since their reunion, she looked every one of the 11 years that had passed. "Heartbreaking. We could observe your timeline but not interact with it. We watched you sacrifice your personal lives, your career goals, your relationships, everything, to search for us. We wanted desperately to find a way to let you know we were safe, but any direct contact would have risked creating paradoxes that could have damaged both timelines." Michael leaned forward. "The work you're doing here, the Temporal Reconciliation Project, how close are you to success?" "Very close. The breakthrough came about 6 months ago when we finally understood how to stabilize the quantum bridges between parallel timelines. Your father's medical knowledge and my nursing background turned out to be crucial for understanding the biological aspects of temporal displacement. We've been able to help refine the process so that timeline mergers don't cause psychological trauma or memory conflicts." Thomas appeared in the doorway, having apparently finished his work for the day. "The question we need you to consider is whether you're prepared to trust the process. Timeline merger isn't like stepping from one room to another. For a brief period during the transition, you'll exist in both timelines simultaneously, experiencing 2 different versions of your life history. Some people find that overwhelming." Sarah's police training focused on practical concerns. "What are the risks? What happens if something goes wrong during the process?" "The worst-case scenario," Thomas admitted, "is that you could become permanently displaced yourselves, trapped between timelines without a stable reality to return to. But we've conducted the procedure successfully with 12 other families. The risks are minimal if you're psychologically prepared for the transition." Williams appeared behind Thomas, carrying what appeared to be official documents. "Detective Chen, Mr. Chen, I need to inform you that your timeline has already begun adapting to your absence. Lieutenant Santos filed the missing persons report exactly 72 hours after your departure, as you instructed, but the investigation has taken an interesting turn." He handed Sarah a printed news article from the Roswell Daily Record, dated 3 days after their disappearance. The headline read, "Police detective and brother missing. Search focuses on federal land southeast of city." Sarah read the article with growing amazement. Lieutenant Santos had not only followed her instructions precisely, but had used the disappearance of 2 more Chen family members to reopen the cold case file on Thomas and Margaret's 2001 disappearance. The article quoted Santos extensively about the possibility of a connection between the 2 incidents and mentioned that federal authorities were being contacted about potential activity on restricted government land. "Your timeline is actively investigating this facility," Williams continued, "which means we have perhaps 24 hours before we need to either complete the temporal reconciliation process or relocate our operations to avoid discovery by conventional law enforcement." The pressure was mounting, but Sarah found herself thinking about Lieutenant Santos, about the other families of missing persons she had worked with during her time with the Roswell Police Department, about the dozens of cold cases that might never be solved if she chose to remain in temporal suspension with her parents. "Mom, Dad, can the Temporal Reconciliation Project be completed without us? Can you reunite the other displaced families even if we choose to return to our timeline?" Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances. "Theoretically, yes," Margaret said, "but the process works most effectively when it begins with a family that has strong emotional connections across both timelines. Your search for us, your refusal to give up, created a quantum entanglement between the timelines that makes reconciliation much more stable. You're the ideal test case for large-scale implementation. Michael had been studying the technical documents their parents had shown them earlier. What happens to the other displaced people if we say no? Do they remain trapped here forever? Williams answered grimly. Not forever. But it could be decades before we develop alternative methods for timeline reconciliation. Your parents' breakthrough was largely possible because of the specific conditions created by your 11-year search. Replicating those conditions artificially would require significantly more time and resources. The weight of responsibility was staggering. Sarah and Michael had spent 11 years trying to save their own family, only to discover that their decision could determine the fate of dozens of other families trapped by the same mysterious circumstances. As evening settled over the facility, though there were no windows to confirm the time of day, the twins found themselves facing a choice that transcended personal preference. They could choose to merge the timelines, reuniting their family and potentially dozens of others, but sacrificing their identities as people shaped by loss and searching. Or they could return to their reality, preserving their sense of self, but condemning other families to continued separation and uncertainty. We need to see the other displaced people, Sarah said finally. Before we decide, we need to understand who else is affected by our choice. Williams nodded. That can be arranged. But I should warn you, meeting the other displaced individuals will make your decision considerably more difficult. The common area where the displaced individuals gathered each evening looked like a support group meeting organized by people who had never expected to need support. 47 men and women, ranging in age from 22 to 78, all frozen at the moment of their temporal displacement, all carrying the weight of families they had been forced to leave behind. Director Williams introduced Sarah and Michael to the group, explaining that the Chen twins represented the first successful contact between displaced individuals and their families from the shadow timeline. The reaction was immediate and emotional. These were people who had been waiting years or decades for any sign that their loved ones were still searching, still hoping, still believing in the possibility of reunion. Maria Gonzalez had been displaced from Las Cruces in 1987, leaving behind 3 young children who were now approaching 40. She showed Sarah and Michael photographs she had been allowed to take from observation monitors, pictures of her children graduating from high school, getting married, having children of their own, all while believing their mother had simply vanished without explanation. My youngest daughter became a social worker, Maria told them, tears flowing freely. She specializes in helping families of missing persons. She spent her entire adult life trying to help other people find what she couldn't find for herself. James Patterson, displaced from Farmington in 1994, had left behind a wife and newborn son. My boy is 19 now, he said, showing them surveillance footage of a young man who looked remarkably like his father. He's studying criminal justice at the University of New Mexico. His mother told him stories about me, but he doesn't really remember having a father. Each story was heartbreaking, but they were also inspiring. Without exception, the families of displaced individuals had been transformed by their loss in ways that made them more compassionate, more determined to help others, more committed to justice and truth than they might have been otherwise. The shadow timeline had created a generation of people dedicated to solving mysteries and healing trauma because they had lived with unresolved loss. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, displaced from Albuquerque in 1975, had perhaps the most complex situation. My daughter became a physicist, she told the twins. She's been trying to develop technology to locate missing persons using quantum mechanics and temporal field research. She doesn't know she's been working on the exact problem that caused my disappearance. Thomas and Margaret joined the group, carrying technical equipment that would allow them to demonstrate the temporal reconciliation process. What we want to show you, Thomas explained to his children, is that timeline merger doesn't erase the experiences of either reality. It integrates them. The demonstration was unlike anything Sarah and Michael had ever witnessed. Using volunteer Maria Gonzalez, the Chen parents activated what appeared to be a localized version of the temporal reconciliation technology. For approximately 30 seconds, Maria existed simultaneously in both timelines, her consciousness split between her current location in the facility and her original timeline in 1987 Las Cruces. During those 30 seconds, Maria was able to communicate directly with her 3 children across the temporal divide. They couldn't see or hear her, but they experienced what could only be described as sudden, overwhelming certainty that their mother was alive and trying to contact them. The full reconciliation process, Margaret explained as Maria recovered from the demonstration, extends this contact over several hours, allowing both versions of reality to gradually merge into a single integrated timeline. The displaced individual returns to their original temporal position, but everyone involved retains memories of both realities. Michael struggled to understand the implications. So Maria's children would remember growing up without their mother, but they would also remember growing up with her present. Both sets of memories would be equally real, equally formative. The pain of loss and the joy of presence would both be part of their identity, but the loss would no longer be ongoing. It would be historical rather than current. Williams checked his watch and looked concerned. "Detective Chen, Mr. Chen, I need to inform you that our surveillance indicates federal investigators are mobilizing resources to locate this facility. If we're going to attempt timeline reconciliation, it needs to begin within the next few hours." Sarah felt the weight of 47 pairs of eyes looking at her hopefully. These weren't just displaced individuals. They were parents, spouses, children who had been torn from their families by circumstances beyond their control. Their return to normal reality depended on her and Michael's willingness to trust a process they didn't fully understand and accept a transformation of their own identities they couldn't fully predict. "Mom, Dad," Sarah said quietly, "if we choose timeline reconciliation, what happens to our memories of searching for you? What happens to the people we became because of our loss?" Margaret took her daughter's hands. "Those experiences become part of a larger story. You'll remember being the police officer who was driven to solve missing persons cases because you lost your parents. But you'll also remember being the police officer whose parents supported her career choice and celebrated her graduation from the academy. Both versions of Sarah Chen will be real. Both will be part of who you are." Thomas addressed Michael's concerns. "Your skills as an investigator, your expertise with computer systems, your dedication to helping families find missing loved ones, none of that disappears. It becomes enhanced by the support system you would have had if we had never been displaced." The final decision came down to a question of faith, faith in their parents' work, faith in a technology they couldn't fully comprehend, and faith that love was stronger than the fear of losing the identities they had built around trauma and loss. Sarah looked at Michael, seeing her own resolve reflected in his eyes. "We've spent 11 years searching for you. If timeline reconciliation can reunite our family and help all these other families, then we're prepared to take that step." Director Williams activated the facility's communication systems, preparing to coordinate with the other temporal research installations that would be required for large-scale reconciliation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to attempt to return everyone to their original timelines. The process will begin in 1 hour." As the displaced individuals prepared for what they all hoped would be their final night in temporal suspension, Sarah and Michael Chen stood with their parents, ready to risk everything they had become for the chance to restore everything they had lost. The timeline reconciliation process began at exactly midnight New Mexico time on October 20th, 2012. For the next 6 hours, reality itself would be negotiable, as 49 people attempted to bridge the gap between what was and what should have been. When dawn broke over Roswell, New Mexico, the Chen family was finally home. 6 months later, Detective Sarah Chen sat in her office at the Roswell Police Department, reviewing case files that somehow felt both familiar and completely new. Her memories contained 2 different versions of her career, one driven by the desperate need to find her missing parents, and another supported by their encouragement and guidance throughout her training and early years in law enforcement. Both sets of memories were equally real, equally formative, but the integration had created something more powerful than either version alone. She was still the determined investigator who had spent 11 years searching for answers, but she was also the confident officer whose parents had attended her graduation from the police academy and celebrated every promotion. Michael's experience had been similar. His programming skills and investigative expertise remained exactly as they had been, but his motivation had shifted from obsessive searching to constructive helping. He had used his technical abilities to develop a nationwide database for tracking missing persons cases, working with law enforcement agencies across the country to prevent other families from experiencing the uncertainty his family had once lived with. The timeline reconciliation had been successful beyond their most optimistic expectations. All 47 displaced individuals had been successfully integrated into their original timelines, reuniting families that had been separated for decades. The process had created some unusual side effects. Children who remembered both growing up without their parents and growing up with them present. But psychological evaluations showed that the integration had been universally positive. Most remarkably, the experience had transformed the families involved into some of the most effective advocates for missing persons investigations in the country. People who remembered the pain of loss but were no longer living with unresolved trauma proved to be uniquely qualified to help others navigate similar situations. Federal Research Station 47 had been officially closed following the Timeline Reconciliation Project. Director Williams and his staff had been reassigned to other classified research installations, though Williams had told Sarah and Michael that similar temporal displacement phenomena were being monitored at several locations throughout the southwestern United States. Dr. Harold Voss had not lived to see the success of the project he had helped initiate. The 91-year-old physicist had died peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks after the timeline reconciliation, apparently having accomplished the final goal that had motivated him to break decades of classified silence. Lieutenant Santos had been promoted to captain, partly in recognition of her role in investigating the Chen family disappearances and her persistence in pursuing leads that had initially seemed impossible to believe. The official report on the case had been classified at a level that would keep it secret for at least 50 years, but Santos retained detailed personal knowledge of everything that had occurred. Thomas and Margaret Chen had returned to their positions at Roswell General Hospital, though their 11 years of experience with advanced medical technology at the Temporal Research Facility had made them among the most skilled healthcare professionals in New Mexico. They had no official memory of their time in temporal displacement, but they retained all the knowledge and expertise they had gained during those years. The integration of their family had been profound and healing, but it had also created a shared understanding of how fragile normal reality truly was. The Chens knew that their experience was not unique, that temporal displacement continued to affect families throughout the country, and that their story was part of a much larger pattern of phenomena that government agencies were still working to understand and control. Sarah kept Dr. Voss's classified documents in a secure file in her office, knowing that someday another family might need the same kind of guidance she and Michael had received. The search for truth never really ended. It just transformed into a commitment to helping others find their own answers. On quiet evenings, when the family gathered for dinner in their restored home on Pine Street, they would sometimes share memories from both timelines, stories of the search and stories of the years they had spent together. Both versions of their history were real. Both had shaped who they had become, and both were part of a larger story about love, persistence, and the power of families to transcend even the barriers of time itself. The Chen family case had been officially closed, marked resolved in the Roswell Police Department database. But for Sarah, Michael, Thomas, and Margaret Chen, the real resolution was simpler and more profound. They were home, they were together, and they carried within themselves the knowledge that some searches are worth continuing, no matter how impossible they seem. In a town famous for its mysteries, the Chen family had found that the greatest mystery was not what had happened to them, but how love could be strong enough to bridge any gap, even the gap between different versions of reality itself. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases throughout America. Thank you for following the story of the Chen family. We'll see you in the next video.